Hello everyone, welcome to the penultimate lecture of the course. This is the first of two lectures on Deleuze and Guattari. We'll be looking this lecture at their first study, their first major work, which is Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. It is likely to be a long lecture, so I will not give you much in the way of big introductions. So the lecture structure, we're going to look at Deleuze and Guattari's project, which I guess in a way is a big introduction. Before we talk actually quite a bit about psychoanalysis and the constitution of the subject, looking particularly at the work of Jacques Lacan, who is a key figure in the text, a key figure in Deleuze and Guattari's intellectual world as well, particularly Guattari's. Where we would then look at the main structure, the main ideas of Anti-Oedipus itself. That will include desiring machines and their syntheses, the notion of social production and social machines, the social machines and capitalism and psychoanalysis, desire and revolution. As you might be able to tell from that quick summary, there's actually quite a lot of technical terminology in Deleuze and Guattari's writings, which we'll have to go through both in this lecture and in the next lecture. It's tough going, but I hope this will make sense to you, and I hope you'll get something out of it too. So I've given you various sections of Anti-Oedipus to read, and I think it amounts to maybe about 120 pages of what's a good 380, I think, page book, depending on which printing you have, I should say. The preface, you've actually already read, that's Michel Foucault's preface to the text, parts of chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. The lecture itself, I will be including things that aren't covered in the readings, but which are important to understand the readings. In particular, the different kinds of social machines. I've only given you, in the readings, material on capitalism as a social machine, not the other social machines they talk about, but I will talk about them a bit in the lecture. And I haven't really talked much about, in the content of what I've given you, I haven't given you really anything on schizoanalysis and the goals of schizoanalysis, but I will talk about those as well. If you wanted to read more of the book, I don't think you need to read for the purposes of the course. You don't need to read these long engagements with Freud, which are in chapter 1, chapter 2 in particular. Nor I think you necessarily need to go through the other social machines, which are in chapter 3. But if you wanted to look at the last two sections of chapter 4 on the first and second positive tasks of schizoanalysis, I didn't want to give that to you as assigned reading because that would add another, I think, 60 or maybe even 80 pages to the reading. So I tried to keep it short. But like I say, I will be talking about some of the material. I'll be quoting from pages from those sections of the work. All right. So without further ado, a little bit of background on Deleuze-Guattari and the project. So Anti-Oedipus is published in 1972. It's their first collaborative work. They also wrote a second work of this Capitalism and Schizophrenia series, which is 1,000 Plateaus. That came out in 1980. And for the next lecture, we'll be reading one of the plateaus. There are 15 of them in 1,000 Plateaus. It's the plateau on faciality. And I could have given you a number of others. So it does really quite shape the direction of the last lecture. There were several directions I could have taken with it. But I wanted to give you the faciality one. Because I think it ties in maybe more with some of the other weeks on the course. Even though it maybe does a bit less with the kinds of politics and ethics that Deleuze and Guattari are trying to outline in that work. But anyway, that's two of their works. They also wrote a book on Kafka and What is Philosophy, which was the last work that they wrote together, although there's the story which is that Deleuze basically wrote the book and Guattari kind of signs his name to that at the end. But anyway, this is their first work. It came out in 1972. They met in 1969 in the summer. Deleuze was already a prominent academic philosopher in France, and one of the key figures of the 1960s French philosophical scene, along with the young Derrida and Foucault and Lyotard and others, as well as more figures like Althusser and Sartre, who are still around at the time. Deleuze himself is prominent at this point for writing a series of monographs which offer these quite idiosyncratic readings or even rereadings of key philosophical figures, works on Hume and Kant and Spinoza and Nietzsche, which you might have read if you took the first term course, because that was a key secondary source for Nietzsche that I talked about a lot. Wrote some key essays and a book on Bergson. Later writes a book on Foucault, by the way, which is on the reading list for this term's course. Anyway, so he's famous for these readings, as well as two books on literary figures, a book on Proust and a book on Sacher Masoch. And by this point, he had also published two major works of, you could say, his original philosophy, still quite tied into the history of philosophy, but they're not books on the history of philosophy or on particular figures. And those are Difference and Repetition and the Logic of Sense. Two projects where Deleuze is trying to rethink the nature of philosophy as such, and particularly take it away from the kind of traditional understanding of philosophy, which links it to representation and knowledge. So thinking about ideas of difference, for example, that we've already discussed when talking about the non-identical in Adorno, or the Jews in Lyotard, or various notions of otherness in Foucault. So that's what Deleuze is by 1969. Guattari, on the other hand, is a kind of left-wing militant organizer. He was a student of Jacques Lacan. He was, in fact, a patient and a student of Lacan's, and was seen to be his heir apparent at the time, his successor. Although after the publication of Anti-Oedipus, that changed. They never really quite had the same relationship afterwards. He was also, at the time, the director of an experimental psychiatric clinic at Labor, where he was developing practices linked to institutional analysis, what was originally known as institutional psychotherapy, or institutional psychoanalysis or institutional psychotherapy, which became institutional analysis later on. Form of group psychotherapy links the study and treatment of mental illness to social and institutional context. So the basic idea of it was that mental illnesses are not individual illnesses. They're tied up with social and institutional relationships and contexts. There were all sorts of aspects of the way treatment and life at Labor including, for example, lots of role reversals and quite a horizontal organization of the clinic itself. So, the doctors also did the cleaning and the cooking and things like that. They oftentimes switched roles and stuff. There were lots of, what do they call it now, with 360-degree appraisals, for example, that you have in the workplace and stuff today. But institutional analysis, as Guattari is developing it, is very heavily influenced by Lacan and Marx. And in the pair of them, he's the political activist at the time. Deleuze, whatever his politics were, and as I said in previous weeks, he becomes active with Foucault, for example. Doesn't have the presence, I suppose you could say, that Guattari has organizationally in the left movement in France. So they meet, as I say, in the summer of 1969, after Guattari has, on the basis of a review that Guattari has written of Difference and Repetition, which had come out in 1968, and Logic of Sense, which had come out in 1969. That had been a review that Lacan had invited Guattari to write and was going to be published in his journal before Lacan decided he didn't like the review. Because in large measure it's actually not really a review of those two books, such as a certain kind of riffing of everything that Guattari is doing. But it introduces ideas. It's an analysis of Deleuze's critique of structuralism in those two texts, where Guattari introduces the concept of the machine and says that this is the thing that Deleuze is missing in his work. And it's on the basis of that review that they have their first meeting. They agree to start working together and writing together. 1972, Anti-Oedipus is the first product of that. Okay? Now, Anti-Oedipus itself is in many respects born out of the events in the spirit of the May 68 protests in France, which almost brought down the Gaullist government, but which eventually led to an election that gave the Gaullists more power, gave them bigger majorities. These were protests that begin amongst student groups in Paris, and they seemingly quite spontaneously emerge into a much more widespread protest that includes general strikes. Unions get involved, there are general strikes, all sorts of other disorder, I suppose you could say, for a good serious number of weeks and months. And there's a widespread kind of revolutionary spirit that emerges. It's neither predicted nor in large measure initially even supported by most of the prominent traditional thinkers of the left. So a figure like Althusser, who doesn't seem to take the protest seriously at the start, is kind of caught flat-footed, and his reputation never quite recovers from his kind of refusal to engage with or see the importance of the political events that are taking place. And there's an argument to be made, that is made, that the May 68 protests don't in the end really lead to anything significant. As I say, the government becomes more powerful in the next elections. There's a retrenchment of against a lot of the things that the protests were protesting against. There's a creation of this new experimental university branch of the University of Paris in Vincennes, which basically is the effect of getting all the radical students and professors outside of Paris. They get shipped over, get set up there, and they get to go and do their stuff over there, and Paris becomes, I suppose intentionally is made to quiet down. That is, in Vincennes, that's where Foucault gets hired to put together the philosophy department. He hires Deleuze and Guattari, among others, and then he leaves and goes to the Collège de France, where he gives in 1970 the inaugural lecture, The Order of Discourse, that we looked at in the first Foucault lecture. But as I say, there's this kind of emergence of actual revolutionary protest and a revolutionary spirit, which Deleuze and Guattari are always, throughout their careers, their writings afterwards, are quite committed to. They say that what happened, and this is what people don't get, the people who say that nothing changed in May 68, what they say changed is that there was the emergence of a certain kind of desire, collectively, a certain kind of revolutionary desire that reverberates later on, even if there seemed to be a lack of any real institutional changes. But they think of that as significant. And one of the aspects of that revolutionary desire is its horizontal and non-hierarchical character, and its lack of a kind of friend-enemy distinction and binary of the sort that, well, in the last lecture I mentioned, Foucault is finds quite problematic, these kind of friend-enemy thinking that he finds in intellectual battles is what he's talking about, but also in politics more generally. So Maurice Blanchot wrote a little piece in something called The Unavowable Community, where he mentions this kind of spirit in May 68 as, quote, the impossibility of recognizing an enemy, taking into account a particular form of adversity. All of that was vivifying while hastening the resolution, though there was nothing to be resolved, given that the event had taken place, had it taken place? Question mark. Blanchot is speaking about the event very much in these kinds of Nietzschean Foucauldian terms in that text. Where the event hasn't happened and it's to come, but it has already happened, etc., etc. And May 68 has that kind of character in the kinds of analysis you get from people like Deleuze and Guattari as well. So this text, as I say, Anti-Oedipus, is born out of that because it's a thesis on the nature of desire and revolutionary desire, or how desire is, in its original form and as such, revolutionary, and is then manipulated, stratified in certain ways. Stratification is a term from 1,000 Plateaus rather than Anti-Oedipus, but we'll actually discuss that in the last lecture. Now, the work itself is a reinterpretation of contemporary capitalism and society through a focus on material relations of production, not in the Marxist sense of economic production, but in the sense of a materialist production of desire, or desiring production as material production, and how the production of desire directly infiltrates and shapes social formations of control, in a way like, but not quite like, in traditional Marxism, the economic base of society creates also this superstructure, which is legal, social, political, ideological, and so forth. They don't make that division of a base superstructure, but they do make a division of material desiring production that directly shapes all this other social production. Social forms, we could say. Identities, they include the law, they include categories, social categories, and so forth. In that regard, it's an attack on traditional Marxist thought of economic production as really what material production is, and as the material base of society, and as economic contradiction as the driving force of radical and revolutionary change. One of the key theses of the text is that capitalism does not, or society, I should say, doesn't change because of contradictions in its economic material base. And in fact, capitalism is the system that lives off of those kinds of contradictions. In fact, those contradictions, for Deleuze and Guattari, don't bring capitalism down. They're the way in which it continues. So capitalism persists as a kind of self-contradictory, on the level of economic production, structure and system, or social form. That might be a better term to use. So it's an attack on that, or critique of that. And it's also an attack on theories and institutions of psychoanalysis, which has some resonance with Adorno's critique of psychology, some of Foucault's critiques of psychoanalysis, which are seen to be, Deleuze and Guattari argue, that they are complicit with, rather than being critical and antagonistic to, the structures of capitalism and the subjectivity upon which it depends. So if you remember Adorno's critique of psychology, or psychoanalysis really, as launching a critique, or an apparent critique of bourgeois society, by noting how bourgeois morality rests upon incestuous desires in the family. That's Freud's thesis. It seems to be a critique of bourgeois society, and yet it ends up, Adorno says, basically supporting that society. The role of psychology or psychoanalysis for Adorno is basically to take neurotic people who have every rational reason to be neurotic in a completely irrational society, which is modern liberal capitalism. It takes those people and it makes them well adjusted in their neurosis so that they can be productive, so that they can go to work. So the simple way of thinking about it is society screws you up. Psychoanalysis doesn't fix that, because that would require fixing society. It makes you well adjusted enough in your being screwed up that you could still be productive. Something like that, not exactly, but something like that is what Deleuze and Guattari are going to be arguing, that psychoanalysis is primarily complicit with, is in fact complicit with, the maintenance of this system that on some level it might also seem to be critical of. And in large measure, that's because psychoanalysis, as Deleuze and Guattari will argue, as other people in this time period will argue, Irigaray, a feminist psychoanalyst and critic of both Freud and Lacan, will argue, psychoanalysis, institutionally and in its theory, is blind to historical conditions of its emergence. And that's why, for example, there will be a notion of an Oedipus complex, which seems to be cross-cultural and transcultural and transhistorical. Psychoanalysis emerges within modern society, modern disciplinary society, as Foucault will talk about it, disciplinary normalizing society, modern capitalist society. Now, one important point to note, throughout this text, Deleuze and Guattari try and save Lacan, not exactly unlike the way Harry and Meghan were saying, oh, but the Queen was really always wonderful to us, right? Like, you can't criticize the Queen, it seems. They won't criticize Lacan directly. They'll basically say it's his followers. It's the Lacanians who have Oedipalized everything, who've read the Oedipus complex into everything. Lacan, they kind of say, is at least trying to go beyond the Oedipus complex. That view of Lacan changes after this text, and just more and more there's more and more antagonism towards Lacan, towards psychoanalysis in general, in the years that follow. Although there are stories that, despite all of this, there are stories that Lacan was not in fact dissatisfied with this text. There's a story that Deleuze tells. He's the only one who tells it, so who knows? There's nobody to verify it. That after the publication of the text, and Guattari apparently was very, very nervous about even telling Lacan what was in this text, thinking he would break their friendship. Deleuze afterwards he says he was summoned to Lacan's office. He says it's the only way in which this could be, that's the only way you could refer to it. He's made to wait in a waiting room forever until Lacan has time to see him, and then he's summoned into Lacan's office and he says that Lacan is going through this whole list of his students and disciples, all of whom except Jacques-Alain Miller, who's his daughter is married to. He thinks they're all useless, and then he says, according to Deleuze, he says, I need more students like you. So that is the sign, or the indication, or at least Deleuze's story, that Lacan is not entirely dissatisfied with the work. But there you go. They take pains to try and separate Lacan from this criticism of Lacanian and other schools of psychoanalysis. Okay. Now the work is also, that's a critique of capitalism, it's a reinterpretation of capitalism, which offers also a critique or challenge to Marxist thought and psychoanalytic thought. The work is also an account of fascism and its relation to desire, where Deleuze and Guattari adapt a thesis from Wilhelm Reich, that thesis on the mass psychology of fascism, that contends that the masses in Europe in the 1920s and 30s were not duped into fascism; they wanted fascism. So, in this side of things is in a way also a critique of Marxist notions of ideology, of the idea that people are fooled by an ideology into adopting something that is a form of politics that directly is against their interests. Fascism in the 20s and 30s, you could think of working class Thatcherites and Reagan Democrats in the 1980s, for example, who people on the left are screaming, you're voting against your interests. You're voting to make yourself poorer, right? Brexit, I suppose, that's also a more up-to-date version of you're voting against your interests. You're being fooled. We're Brexit here. We're Brexiters if you are anti-Brexit. We're the people who voted for Brexit being fooled by lies. Deleuze and Guattari's thesis, taken from Reich, is it wasn't that they were fooled, it's that they wanted it. All right? And you could, by the way, argue this, you could just elaborate on this, that in order to be fooled, you can't be fooled unless you want it to be fooled in some way. Unless there's something in your desire, you desire to be given this lie, to be given this picture of the world. All right? The way in which they describe it is fascism is something that's desired, and what fascism really is a desire for desire's own repression. Now that's the historical emergence of fascism as a manifestation of individual and collective desire, since they're never fully distinct for Deleuze and Guattari. It's that desires its own repression. But it's also a manifestation not of historical fascism, but of the fascism within all of us. So it's an account, I should say, of the fascism within all of us. What Foucault mentions in the preface, and we went over this a bit in the last lecture, the Foucault lecture, on ethics. Foucault refers to this as the fascism in all of us, in our heads and in our everyday behavior. The fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. All right? Now, with capitalism itself, the summary thesis of the text is that capitalism, which is a social form that is a formation of desire, a formation of desire that desires its own repression, this social form, economic form of capitalism, engenders a deterritorializing movement of schizophrenia. We'll talk a little bit more later on about what deterritorialization means. Capitalism produces schizophrenia, which constantly threatens to tear capitalism apart, and it has to be managed by a certain kind of reterritorialization, they say, of schizophrenia that transforms it into neurosis. So capitalism creates a certain kind of movement that would destroy capitalism unless it also was structuring its subjects in such a way as it turns them into neurotics. Neurotics who are manageable, in the same sense that Foucault talks about delinquents being manageable, so forth. The neurotic subjectivities are fundamental to capitalism, and that's the way in which capitalism is not destroyed by its contradictions, but it thrives on them. Capitalism will be a system that works because it breaks down. It will work because it has contradictions. But that will turn out to be Deleuze and Guattari's general thesis about all social forms, about all sub-social forms, molecular forms, as they call them. They work by breaking down. All right. Last little bit about the project, and then we can take a break. I'm going to try and, this may end up being 5-part lecture, but I'd like to try and keep it as like 5 30-minute parts if I can. So, well, we'll see how that works out, because that would make it 2.5 hours. That wouldn't make it the longest lecture, which I am going into this thinking it might end up being that long. Anyway, last point about the project. Really important point. Schizophrenia, when Deleuze and Guattari are talking about it, when they talk about capitalism producing schizophrenia, they are not referring to the mental illness. They might be referring to it when they talk about neurosis, but they're not referring to schizophrenia. They're also not celebrating schizophrenia as in celebrating mental illness. They sometimes get accused of that. Just like they're not celebrating pirates and other types in 1,000 Plateaus. Some people accuse them of having this romantic image of nomadic warriors, who they also say nomads could be, heroin addicts, homeless on the street. So they're not really thinking about it in those terms. But anyway, they're most certainly not thinking about schizophrenia. When they refer to desire as schizophrenic, they are not referring to the mental illness schizophrenia. They are referring instead to a form of what they say is the original form that desire takes, where it is simply about making connections and proliferating connections. That desire works by this proliferation of connections of one thing to another in a horizontal way, which therefore is antithetical to all sorts of hierarchies that societies require. Societies, in order to maintain their hierarchies, will have to do something to disable the kinds of horizontal connections that desire always, and desiring machines, as they refer to it, always create, right? Or tend towards, I should say. They don't always create them. That's one of the issues. So they offer something, not psychoanalysis, but schizoanalysis. Schizoanalysis examines forms of desire which seek horizontal connections and the proliferation of connections, versus the ways in which that gets disabled in order to create desires that desire their own repression, the repression of this proliferating connectivity. And the central question of schizoanalysis is not what desire means or what it seeks. That's the psychoanalyst question. What is it you seek? You seek your mother, or you seek your father, or what have you. You secretly want your mother. So it's not what desire seeks. It's not what it means. It's not how it functions in society. That's the ethologist question. It's how does it work? How does desire work? It's not normative, and it's not meant to be a normative analysis either. So it doesn't matter what it means. It matters how it works. I've changed the subtitle of Tom Cruise saying it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what I can prove. It doesn't matter what it means. It matters how it works. That's the central analytical approach Deleuze and Guattari are going to take. I'm going to stop it here, and then we'll do a section on Lacan, and then we'll go on from there. So I'll see you for part 2.